and welcome. My name is Sabir, pronouns he, him, and I direct events here at the Strand. For a little bit of history, the Strand was founded in 1927 by Benjamin Bass over on 4th Avenue's Book Row. Stretching from Union Square to Astor Place, Book Row gradually dwindled from 48 bookstores until after over 94 years, the Strand is the sole survivor, now run by third generation owner Nancy Bass Wyden. We want to thank all of you for your support. Without our loyal community of book lovers, we wouldn't be here today, and we are so truly appreciative of all of you. Tonight, we are thrilled to have with us James Ivory for the launch of his new memoir, Solid Ivory. James Ivory is an Academy Award-winning director, producer, and screenwriter. His directorial work includes A Room with a View, Howard's End, and The Remains of the Day, for each of which he was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Director. In 2017, he won the Academy Award for Best Adapted Screenplay for Call Me by Your Name. He has also won 3 BAFTA awards, a Directors Guild of America Lifetime Achievement Award, and a Writers Guild of America Award, among many other honors. Joining James in conversation tonight is Peter Cameron. Peter Cameron's novels include What Happens at Night, Coral Glynn, Someday This Pain Will Be Useful to You, and The City of Your Final Destination. He is also the author of 3 collections of short fiction, and more than 10 of his stories have been published in The New Yorker. He is taught writing at Sarah Lawrence College, Yale University, and Columbia University. And so, without further ado, please join me in welcoming James and Peter to the stage.
Welcome, James. Good evening.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing okay. How are you?
I'm fine. Yes.
I can't believe we're here doing this.
No,
it's
I
very
can't
exciting.
do it. And well, anyway, never mind.
Okay. Well, anyway, I'd like to thank the Strand for hosting us this evening. This is a big event for Jim and I. We've been working on this book for a long time, and it was just published 2 days ago. And we're both really thrilled to be here. And we want to thank you all for joining us. I believe, Jim, that you were going to read a little bit from the book to start us off. Is that right?
Yes, I didn't realize to start us off, but I will do that.
Yeah, no, why don't you do that so we get a feel for the book and hear it in your own voice. And I believe you're going to read something, a short piece, which is about your adolescent years, right?
From my high school days, probably I was a junior in high school when this event happened. It's not really an event. It's called A Significant Memory.
Okay, great.
There's a question mark after that. That's a significant memory.
Okay.
That's what we put in the book, so I guess we haven't made up our mind about how significant it is. During my junior year in high school, sometime in the winter months, I went with my parents to have dinner at the Officers Club at the Marine base near Klamath Falls. I don't know whose guests we were, possibly the man I'm going to write about. I wore slacks and a tweed sport jacket, and to complete my ensemble, a pink satin bow tie. It was the sort of trashy thing, like plaid shoelaces, the teenage boys wore in the early 1940s, and that must have seemed to a Marine officer who might have had his own memories of other teenage boys, slightly older than I, in battle fatigues in the Far East or North Africa, particularly silly and effeminate. We had already had our dinner, I think, and were sitting around afterwards in the lounge, the grown-ups enjoying a drink or brandy, perhaps. Suddenly, a middle-aged officer with the short graying bristling mustache, our host, or someone who passed by, came up to me and confronted me on the subject of the pink satin necktie. He didn't like it. It was stupid and girlish. The silence fell. Was he drunk? I expected my father, or at least my mother, or even my sister, who was very pugnacious and quick to take offense, to come to my rescue, but no one spoke. I could feel my parents' embarrassment, particularly my father's, yet he said nothing. The officer went on, standing over me, and began to criticize more than merely my tie. He didn't like my appearance generally, nor my manner. I was slim, too slim, and rather too pretty a boy, with my hair worked up into a kind of pompadour, with delicate frowning eyebrows that to the Marines must have looked almost plucked. And no doubt, no doubt I was lolling back with my knees crossed, a large loafer swinging negligently on an out-of-scale teenage foot. Could there have been a lucky penny inserted in the cross strap of these loafers? That too was in style. But the Marine ran out of steam somehow. Perhaps because we all remained silent. Perhaps because, though the unwilling center of attention, I didn't go to pieces. Perhaps because he began to reproach himself, or saw that he was being rude and overbearing, or just plain drunk. And then he said a fatal thing. And I'm surprised I had the cheek to take it up, except that for me, it seemed to be a sink or swim kind of situation. He said, "What do you think of me?" And I replied, "I think you're pompous." There must have been an intake of breath on the part of my parents. Perhaps one of them even said, "Jim," in warning, and then it was over. The bullying stopped, the man went off, we left for home. I felt cross in the car with myself because I had mispronounced pompous, inserting an extra syllable, so it came out pompuous. I had only just learned that word, and no doubt was waiting for the right occasion to use it. I never wore that tie again. I kept it in my drawer for a while and then threw it away. Now that I'm older and have reached that officer's age and more than likely surpassed it, I see that the key sentence in all this must be, "What do you think of me?" Was this fellow one of the thousands of repressed latent homosexuals who were in the services, officers and non-commissioned officers alike, who, upon meeting an effeminate seeming boy, felt irresistibly that he must be bullied or harassed, whether in or out of the barracks? I'll never know. And there must be several valid reasons that he might have chosen to pick on me that night. The other thing I will never know is why my father kept silent. It did not diminish him in my eyes, but I wondered about it then, as I do now. Was he pursuing some deal with the Marine Corps? They would have needed a lot of lumber to build their base. Was this officer someone who requisitioned lumber and who might, if peeved, have gone off to one of the other big lumber companies in Klamath Falls? We never spoke of this episode, not once. It was as if it had never happened. It was too embarrassing to mention. But my mother must have said something that night as they lay there in the wait a minute here, let me turn the page. But my mother must have said something that night as they lay there with the lights out. She probably accused my father, said he should have come to my rescue. And he, so quick to justify himself in all things, probably said that I didn't need being rescued, that I could obviously take care of myself, and that the whole affair boded well for my future in the world of men. For, as he always kept reminding her and telling me, we live in a world of men.
Thank you, Jim. It occurs to me, thinking about the book as a whole and its pieces, because it is a book that's made up of many different pieces, that some of these pieces you wrote, I know, as either letters to Ruth or other people or journal entries, or you wrote them specifically for magazines, sort of pieces about your craft or about specific people. But then there are lots of pieces in this book and several very long pieces that were not written for any specific reason or any specific purpose or to any specific person. Pieces like this and like the Bruce Chatwin piece and like the Dr. Zeck's piece. And I wonder, when you wrote these pieces, what compelled you to write them if you weren't writing them, for a specific reason? And who were you writing them for? Who were you thinking about? Were you writing them for yourself, or were you writing them thinking about a future audience? What were your thoughts?
I was definitely writing them for myself. Let me tell you how one of the longest and I think one of the best pieces came about.
Sure.
After the Great Ball at Wilton in England, I came back to the United States, and I had the film The Europeans had just come out, and I had to go around on a sort of tour of various cities where it was opening to do press interviews and so forth. And I was in Denver, and staying in that wonderful hotel in Denver, I think called the Brown Palace, which I'd heard about, and finally I was staying in it. And I guess I didn't have anything much to do. And I sat down and I wrote that entire thing sitting in my hotel room in Denver about that very, very grand party at Wilton in England. And it just came about like that. And I was only doing it for myself, maybe because I had nothing else to do, or I wasn't reading a book I wanted especially to read at that moment. And that's how they came about. I would just always just sit down and do it for myself. It wasn't really, unless it was an assignment, like the long thing on Vanessa Redgrave was an assignment. I was I was asked by Sight and Sound to write that. So they were mostly just for me, there was no intention of them ever being published or even printed. I mean, they were, and I'd put them away, and some of them I would lose for a while, and then I'd find them years later and pull it out and think, oh, that's not so bad, stuff like that, or this is awful. Why? And but I never threw anything away.
Right. Mm-hmm.
I have everything.
I remember it was about, I think in 2013 or 14, right after Ruth died, that you started showing them to me, because I think you had been sharing them with Ruth. Is that correct? Most of these pieces? Earlier
on, yes. At the beginning, I showed a lot of them to Ruth, and she was very helpful sometimes with the form of some of them. The whole thing that I wrote about Afghanistan, about being in Kabul in 1960, which was a number of short sections.
Yes.
And he helped me to arrange those and made suggestions here and there. So at that time, I was showing everything to her that I wrote. But then I stopped doing that. I don't know why. I think I probably didn't feel that I necessarily needed to show her stuff about my high school boyfriends. That wasn't really something. In fact, she would have been very interested. I mean, I could have shown any of those pieces to Ruth, and I think she would have been interested in what I was saying and who the people were and how I was saying it, and she would have suggested a little change here and there and different words and so on. What's happening?
Sorry, I'm trying to get back.
Hi, can I help you, Peter? What seems to be the issue?
Yeah, somehow my screen got minimized. Wait, let me. And I'm no longer appear to be in the room.
You are still on stage.
Okay, that's good. And can you hear and see me?
Yes.
Okay, then I will continue. Sorry. One of the other things I was thinking about, Jim, was I think this book, one of the things I learned about you from working with you on this book is that you're a really fine writer, and that you do process experiences you've had both as a writer. And I wonder, it's interesting to me because my experience with film is having some of my novels, adapted into film. And it's always made me really glad that I'm a novelist, because as a novelist, you control everything. You have complete control over the product. Whereas I feel like directing a film, you relinquish so much of that control to other people.
Let's say you share the control.
Okay, well, that's what I want to talk to you about. Sort of how do you feel, because I was really aware with this book, how invested in the details of this book you were, and how until the very last minute you wanted to keep correcting things and changing things and fixing things. And I know you're that same way about your films, but there are so many other people, I'm going to quiet my dog in 1 second, involved with your films. And how do you feel about that, about relinquishing that sort of total control? I was just thinking about your pink bow tie and sort of your attention to detail. And in a film you were talking about in the book, you mentioned Daniel Day-Lewis's fingernails and how they bothered you because they were too long, but you decided not to try and correct that because you didn't want to interfere with his performance.
Right.
And I guess as a director, how do you feel like you're controlling it when you're releasing so much control to other people? Which you don't do.
You don't release a lot of control. And this was just a tiny detail that most people wouldn't even see or even worry about, that he had too long fingernails. But for that character, I felt they were too long, and I mentioned it at one point, sort of casually, and I mean, I didn't want to make a big thing of it, and nothing happened, and they went on being long. And so I thought, well, I can't. He's doing such an extraordinary job. I mean, his performance is so wonderful. I'm not going to mess it up by quibbling about something like that, which is a very small and probably unnoticed kind of thing. And that's just the way you have to work with actors. You can't, when they're on a sort of roll, you can't go in there, and unless they do something that's definitely wrong, or do something that you really don't like, or they make some big mistake in the dialogue, you can't go in there and fiddle with them, and it could spoil their mood. It's a matter of mood, and being in the mood to really to practice your art. I mean, what's important to me about all the people that I've hired in movies, they're all artists. You have to, I mean, the ones who actually can be said to be doing art, like actors and writers and set designers and so on. You have to allow them to show you what it is that they've thought up and how they see the problems and what they want to do and so on. You have to let them do that. And you can't jump in there and keep them from doing that. You have to see first. Then, if you don't like something, or you prefer it to be something slightly different or whatever, then you tell them. But on the whole, you trust them because they are artists, and you have to give your trust to these artists that you've hired.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And I mean, they trust me, and I have to trust them.
Right. But then you do feel that you can make your, I mean, let your needs and wants be known very explicitly when it's necessary.
Yeah. Oh, sure. I mean, if something's really wrong,
Right.
or I remember there was a scene in Mr. and Mrs. Bridge in which Paul Newman gets very angry and with a young man who comes to say that he's going to marry her daughter no matter what, his daughter no matter what. Mm-hmm. And he kept slamming his desk drawer. And I thought Mr. Bridge is not the kind of man that would show his anger like that and keep slamming his desk drawer. And I thought, well, now Paul's doing a great job and he's a little touchy sometimes. Right. But I said, I can't have him slamming that desk drawer. It's just wrong. Mm-hmm. So I said, I don't think Mr. Bridge would be slamming that desk drawer like that in front of this boy who he doesn't have a very good opinion of. Right. So we stopped slamming the drawer. Mm-hmm. And these are the kinds of little things that happen all the time when you work with actors. Mm-hmm. And one thing or another. Right. You just have to, each one's a little problem. You have to solve it in a little way, sometimes a big way, and whatever. So
it's interesting. Speaking about Mr. and Mrs. Bridge, I read just recently that you mentioned that in working on that film, you felt like Paul Newman ended up thinking about his father as he was playing that role, and that you also were thinking about your parents. And it made me think about, obviously you invest a lot of yourself in your films, and I'm sure it's in a different way than you invested yourself in this book. But I sort of wonder, do you think about your films, and you've made so many films over the whole course of your life, do you look back at them and do you feel like in some way they're autobiographical? do you feel like your films represent you?
Well, some more than others, and they have autobiographical elements to them, and that and you may be making the film and you're not even aware of that until later.
Right,
Years
right.
might pass, and then you watch the film and you think, so that's what I was thinking about. So that was what was bothering me, or some such thing. You're not always aware of that, but there are films that are very autobiographical. I feel that.
Which ones do you feel are
Well, Mr. and Mrs. Bridge particularly, but
mhm.
also A Soldier's Daughter Never Cries is one. Quartet is another one. I just feel that there were situations between people in there which were very like situations in my own life and then with people that I knew, and that somehow my interest in the thing, or desire to make it, had come out of that, but I wasn't aware of it at the time, as I say.
In instance, like with Quartet, who what was the impetus for that project? Had you read that book and found it interesting to you, or was it something that came from
It
Ruth?
was a book that Ruth was forever where we were, and she was reading all of Jean Rhys's novels, I think, at that time. And she just left that one somewhere. I don't know where we were. Maybe, I think possibly in Paris, or no, it couldn't have been Paris. Anyway, she left that novel and I found it and I began to read it, and I liked it immediately. And I thought, gosh, this would make a wonderful film. But I've always had an interest, or at least at that time, I still had an interest in Paris in the 1920s. It was just, I always wanted to make a film set in Paris in the 1920s. And as that book was, a Quartet. And so I said, oh, this would make a great movie. I think I would love to make this. And she said, oh no, Jim, it's so low spirited. You don't want to make a movie out of that book. I said, yeah, I do. And so we did. And and it is low spirited.
I love that. I love that phrase, low spirited. I've never quite.
And it's one of my favorite films that we made, and one of my best ones, I think. And it was the first one where I felt that everything kind of came together in a proper way. It had taken that long to get there, but that was the first one where it happened. And but it didn't do well at the box office. And it was a depressing story, and probably low spirited.
Right. Can you talk more about what it was that made you feel like that film came together in a way that your previous films had not?
I mean, all the elements seem to be right. I mean, the great thing about it, it's called Quartet because there are mainly only 4 characters in it, and all of those actors were wonderful. And I just liked what they were doing, and so that was a great thing. And then it was the first time we were working in France, and we had wonderful artists there working with us. I mean, extraordinary designers and costume designers, and well, actually the costume designer was English, but I mean the set designers and all the rest of it, and the locations, and it's all an extraordinary cinematographer. So it all kind of came together and gelled in a way that I felt had never had quite before. I'm not saying that the previous films weren't good. They were good. They would include something like Shakespeare Walla, but they weren't all of a piece. But finally, somehow with Quartet, they were. And maybe it was helpful to me that there were only 4 main characters, and the story was developed by just 4 people, and it was not a huge cast, but anyway.
Right. I wonder, you just said sort of that you had always wanted to make a film in Paris in the 20s, and I know when we were putting together this book, we had to decide, what to include, and we left out some pieces and some profiles. Like there was a profile of Saul Steinberg and a profile of Fernand Léger, and I wonder, are there other people that you would like to have written about? Because I know you've known, so many people in so many different ways from so many different walks of life over the years. And
Well, yeah, I mean, I just recently, I knew Vivian Lee, and
Oh,
I was present at various times in her life when things were really kind of going to pieces.
mhm.
And I knew her in this country, I knew her in India, and I knew her in England.
Mhm.
And uh, and I had never written anything about her. And in fact, the other day I sat down and started writing
Did you really? Uh-huh.
Vivian
Mhm.
Lee, and I'm sure I will bring
Uh-huh.
that about. Yeah.
Well,
It's just I don't know. It's just an interest, and I'm sure that I'll do some others.
right. But I think what's interesting about that is the way you approach these people is not through professional experiences with them. It's through personal experiences with them, which lets us see these people in a very unique way, I feel. It's like the George Cukor piece. You didn't work with him, and it's not about him as a director, it's about him as a person. And
Right.
it sounds like you're doing the same thing with Vivian Lee, or your experiences with her.
Right. Well, Ismail had a plan to make a film in Afghanistan about the retreat of the British from Afghanistan in the late 1830s or something, and he wanted her to play the wife of the British commander, and she was named Lady Sales. Well, I can't imagine Vivian Lee going to Afghanistan in the middle of winter at age 60 or whatever she was then.
Uh,
But Ismail was absolutely convinced that she would do it, and that's who he wanted, and so forth. And that's how we came to know her, because there was no script, and there was this frightening book. If you ever want to go to Afghanistan, you read about what happened to the British. I mean, they were annihilated almost to a man,
yes.
and several thousand people with them, and so he was convinced that she would do it. Well, he wooed her for a number of years.
As only Ishmael could, yes.
During that wooing, we became friends with him and her rather, and we saw her. And we were in various places, and at one point she made a trip to India, and she came out, and she wanted to go back to where she had been as a young girl, as a young woman. Her family was from somewhere near East Bengal, somewhere like that, and she wanted to go back to her childhood haunts and that kind of thing. And so she passed through Bombay, and we saw her, and Ismail gave a party for her and all this kind of thing. And she left things behind which were too hot to wear or too heavy to carry. And and she never collected them. And so we had those things for years. And so.
And where are they now?
Well, there was this suit, a woolen suit. Well, the last thing you want in Bombay is a woolen suit.
Right.
Then she left that, and eventually the moths got in. I brought it back to Claberack, and it was here in the house, and then eventually the moths got into it.
Okay.
It was this terrible thing, but I gave it to a designer in England who takes moth-eaten things and turns them into wonderful objects.
Okay. That's a talent.
She has Vivian Lee's suit. Yeah. Someone else we used, she left her purse behind also. We used that as a prop in Bombay Talkie. It was the purse that Jennifer Kindle was a great big purse that she didn't want to travel with. It's Jennifer Kindle banging around with.
That's great. That's wonderful.
Yeah.
We've mentioned Ismail and Ruth, and I wonder, have you thought at all, what would they think of this book? And of you writing this book? And
I don't think
surprised.
I don't. Well, I mean, I don't know. I've been thinking about that lately.
Yeah.
And it's like giving the book to the people that I meet. I write about some of my high school friends.
Yes.
Who are one or two are still alive. Now it's easier to give the book to their children or their grandchildren even. And I know they're going to like it, but I haven't yet given it to the mothers and fathers, and who figure sometimes in the book. And I don't know yet. I'm just, but I don't know what Ruth would. She would have been okay. and Ismail also pretty much, I think, on the whole.
Would they be surprised that you had written this book, do you think?
Not Ruth, no.
Right, because she'd seen so much of it, right?
She'd seen so much of it, and she read a lot of it, yeah. And well, I go into my life with Ismail, and he might not have been best pleased at that, but
it's interesting. You just mentioned sort of your long friendships with people you went to school with, and that's really interesting to me. That because I feel like you're somebody who has come a long way and traveled both in time and distance and geographically in so many ways from where you were brought up. And yet you still seem, your life is still very tied to Oregon and to the places and people you knew there when you were growing up. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that, sort of why do you think that is, that's remained such a constant in your life, and it's a place you continue to go back to, and these are people that you really have maintained close relationships with?
Well, I lived in both Oregon and California. I grew up in Oregon, but then I moved to Los Angeles to go to film school and stayed on there for a bit. And I like being on the West Coast. I mean, I like being in California. I feel perfectly at home there. And as for Oregon, near Klamath Falls, there's this wonderful lake called Lake of the Woods. And my father bought a cabin there in 1941, I guess it was. And so we went there every summer up to that cabin. And I have that cabin now. And it's a wonderful place. And Lake of the Woods is just an extraordinary place. Though lately it has not been so great because of all the forest fires in Oregon. And there's a lot of smoke that blows in. And then I haven't gone the last 2 summers because of because of the pandemic and stuff. But anyway, I'll go this summer. But I love going there. I love being at Lake of the Woods. I don't. Well, I used to do things like, it may seem just unimaginable to people, but I'm water skied and I would swim and all this sort of thing. But as I got older, I read more and more, and now I hardly do anything more other than just read when I go. But I like being there and walking around there and being in the woods. I like the smell of it. I like that lake is in a national forest called the Wainema National Forest. It's just quite huge, and some of which caught fire this last summer. Not near us, luckily. I just like going. I mean, and it's the last of my childhood homes, really.
Right. Yes.
Because I started going there when I was 13, I think. No, 10, I think, was when we until we had our own cabin, we rented cabins, and so I started going there when I was about 10, and it's. When I first went to high school, I didn't like going to Lake of the Woods because it was taking me away from my friends in town, and there was no telephone and no mail and all this kind of thing, and I hated going to Lake of the Woods. But then suddenly it dawned on me that it was a really great place, and I could invite my friends to come to Lake of the Woods, and which I did, and I still know many of them. I mean, those who most of my friends of my age are gone, of course. Obviously, they would be, but there are a few left.
And do those friends those people that you're still in touch with and that you have maintained relationships with over the years, do you feel like they know a different Jim Ivory, or do you still feel connected to that boy?
They don't know a different Jim Ivory. It's the same Jim Ivory. They may not know what Jim Ivory was up to here and there.
Right.
At Dr. Zek's, I mean, they may not know about things like that, but it is the same James Ivory or Jim Ivory. None of them called me Jimmy. I've never liked people who called me Jimmy. I've always thought they wanted something.
So there's just one more question I'd like to ask you, and that's you had mentioned that Ishmael had this idea for this film about the British in Afghanistan, and Ruth brought you Quartet or showed that to you. Were there any of the films that you made that came from you, that they.
Sure. Yeah.
Mhm,
I mean, Shakespeare Walla was an idea of mine that was developed because I knew the family of Shashi Kapoor, who were British actors traveling around India doing Shakespeare. It was my idea to make that, and then the Guru was my idea because I knew someone who was a devotee. He was an Australian who was a devotee of Ali Akbar Khan and like a slave to him. And that was what made me think about making the Guru, what the relationship of these various people are called chelas to great Indian musical masters, great stars, and their relationship, which is almost like a slave, and then there were Bombay Talkie was another one that I wanted to make a film about the Indian film industry. That was an idea of mine, and other things. Savages was cooked up with two friends of mine, George Tro and Michael O'Donoghue. But they were the things I wanted to do. I mean,
so it sounds like pretty much the films you made that were not adaptations were all ideas that you had or projects that you wanted to undertake.
I mean, I had to be interested in them in order to do. If it wasn't, I mean, I had to have some kind of an idea about Roseland's another one. We went to Roseland and we were thinking of doing another kind of film, and we went to Roseland, began going to Roseland and saw all that, and then that came about, and simply because we went there and it seemed like a good story, or could be a good story, and so on. Yeah, I mean,
and those films that weren't adaptations, were you involved with the screenplays? You were, weren't you?
Sometimes yes, sometimes no.
Okay.
The way we worked was in certain things that Ruth did the adaptations of from novels usually. She would do them on her own. And when she'd done something, and when it was done, then she would show it to me and to Ismail, and we'd say, yes, no, I don't like this. I do. Why can't we have that? And so on and so on. Why don't you have that scene? I love that scene. It's my favorite scene. And say why we couldn't have it, and so on. It was like that. But then when we began to work together, sometimes on projects, the way we worked was that I would do the screenplay first. And she would then, I would give it to her, and then she would then take it, and she would work from my screenplay, not go back necessarily to the original book. She would work from my screenplay. And though she might take things from the book here and there that were useful. And then we had this thing that we did together, though it was an adaptation. And we worked like that. I mean, a good example of that is the film The Divorce that we did in the 2003.
And you're working on a screenplay now, is that correct?
Well, I'm working on a screenplay for a television series.
Oh, okay.
Based on a French novel called The End of Eddie, and which, however, they want the people who are making it and want to make it in this country, and it would not be French anymore. But it's such a universal story that, and I've set it in Portland, Oregon, and in the midst of a lumber town, which I know a lot about. And everybody seems happy about it, including Edouard Louis, who wrote it, who's a wonderful young writer in France, and he's happy with that. And I send, whatever I write, I send to him. And is there anything that he thinks I've gone in a wrong direction or something? And occasionally there is, and he tells me, and I adjust. But he's been wonderful to work with, Edouard Louis.
Great. Well, let's see if the people who have joined us this evening have some questions for you, Jim.
Okay.
Hi. So, well, first off, I'm going to say I'm super excited to hear you're adapting The End of Eddie. I love that book. And
most people we don't know it.
Garth Greenwell recommended it at some point. But to the audience questions. Our first question is from V, who asks, when you were the Merchant and Ivory team, how did you and Ismail choose which stories to turn into films? What were your criteria or guiding instincts? And this is going back to your movies like Shakespeare, Walla, or Bombay Talkie.
Well, wait a minute. What happens here? Should I be doing anything?
Oh, yes, that question was directed at you, James. I'm sorry. It was V from our audience asked, when you were the Merchant and Ivory team, how did you and Ismail choose which stories to turn into films?
If we were in India, which we were, at the beginning when we set up our company, I just wanted to go on being in India and making films in India. And by that time we were working with Ruth Jabvala, and we loved working with her. And she liked it turned out to write screenplays. She had no desire ever to write screenplays, and suddenly there she was writing them. And she liked us, and but then we also wanted, and during that period also we also wanted to do films in America, and so we had to think up films we wanted to do, whatever they were. I mean, the first one, the first one really was Roseland.
Mhm. All right, and our next question is Abby, and is from Abby, and I think you've touched upon this in your conversation a bit with Peter, but Abby's asked, what role have you played in designing the interiors of your films? They're always so meticulously constructed.
Well, I wanted to be a set designer for the movies when I was in high school. I mean, I went to movies all the time. You have to remember that in those days there was no television. And there was no theater in Klamath Falls. You went to the movies all the time, and I went to countless movies. I was always interested in how they looked. I mean, the places that they were shot in, and some of them were historical films. I mean, big ones like Gone with the Wind, for instance, which I saw when I was about 11. And so I decided I wanted to be a set designer. And about my junior year in high school, there was an architect doing some work on our house, and I asked him, well, if you wanted to be a set designer, what should you do when you go to college? I mean, how could you prepare for that? He said, go to architectural school. So I did. I went to the University of Oregon Architectural School, which was a very, very good architectural school, very modern. I mean, they're extremely modernist in everything they did and taught. And so I've always had that interest. And but I have to say that I've always had I've just always had an interest in interiors and how they looked and stuff. And I had some wonderful designers, but the designers knew far more than I knew. That's for sure. They knew really how to put all that together. I wouldn't have had any idea about a lot of it, but they knew exactly how to do it.
And our next question is from Lizzie, who asks, before you begin directing a film, where do you start with the research? And I may amend that question to say, how do you begin researching?
Well, it's an automatic thing. Sometimes you really have to go around to all kinds of places for an example, a film like The Remains of the Day. We saw many English country houses before we finally were able to come up with a supposed house, but it was really made up out of 5 different houses. And you just keep going back and looking at it, and that would be true of anything you're involved in. I mean, you just keep going and looking at it and making notes and seeing other things like it and comparing and so forth. It starts at the beginning. I mean, it may even start before you have the idea that you want to make it. You're already, in some kind of way, you're already perhaps thinking about it and putting something together in your mind. before you really even have a project.
And our next question is from Lo, who asks, when you saw the response to Call Me by Your Name and the resonance it took on with the queer community, what did you make of it? Which is
It was such a delightful book. I mean, I really liked that book and enjoyed it, and then well, what could I was just happy. I mean, so many people liked it. I mean, what can I say? I mean, they didn't reject it. And in fact, it meant so much to so many people. They would see it again and again and again. And I think there was something about the relationship between the boy and his father and mother also that was very appealing to people. I don't know. It was basically it isn't a love story with a happy ending exactly, but it is, you feel happy afterwards because of the form that the relationships took and the understanding of the parents and just the way it went along. And yeah, I thought it was great that so many people liked it. Sure.
I think also maybe embedded in that question, or what Lo may have been trying to get at, was if there was anything in sort of the scope of sort of time and the general public's responses to movies with queer content, and if you had any reflections there.
Well, you have to think about another film that we did. The only other, well, we've made 3 films that could be called queer or gay films, only 3. I made 27 films where most of them are rampantly heterosexual, but those 3 are specifically gay. One was a short film called, with James Mason and Mudder Jaffrey, called Autobiography of a Princess, which was made in London. And then we made Morris. And I wanted to make Morris. After we made Room with the View, it seemed to me, I then reread Morris. I think I read it when it first came out in 1971, the novel. Then I reread it after making A Room with the View. And it seemed to me that it really was the same story, but the other side of the coin. And I thought, and that was at a period, because Room with a View was such an enormous success. It was a time when we could do just about anything we wanted. I mean, and particularly with a low budget film, and which it would have been, and was able to be. And so I thought I would like to see the other side of the coin, and that's what we did. And of course, the great thing about that was it was a novel, a homosexual novel that Ian Forster wrote specifically to have a happy ending. He wanted it to have a happy ending, and was very proud of the fact that he had. However, that kept him from publishing it in England, because it did have a happy ending. And most gay films in the early 70s and before had very bad endings, and people always came to grief. I mean, you know, it was unhappy. They got killed, or they died, or whatever. They ran away, or they were not happy. And that was something that made that film stand out, I think, was its happy ending, and why it meant so much to so many people. Not just the ending, but what it was, how it was as a story, and between the 3. I could say a lot more about this, but there's only so much time.
Then our next question is from Mark, who asks, are there any novels you regret not having adapted?
Oh, several. Yeah. Several, and we tried. We did everything in our power to get the rights to it. We wanted to do The Bell Jar of Sylvia Plath, and there was just no way we could. I mean, they were just they wouldn't, and we hadn't reached that area where if Merchant Ivory wanted to take up something, then everybody said, "Oh yeah, wow, let's do it." That hadn't happened yet, Sylvia Plath was back in the days when we were still, relatively unknown and relatively unsuccessful. So we never were able to convince, I think it was Sylvia Plath's mother, to give us the rights. That was one. There were some others along the way. Yeah.
Our next question is from Paul, who says, many of your films deal with a sort of loss. Let me rephrase this. Many of your films deal with both a loss of innocence and an awakening to new realities. Is there something that draws you to that point of transition?
Well, is something that specifically to me? Well, it must be, since I've done it so often. There must be something. I couldn't put my finger on it why that is, but of course it's good fiction, and the good fiction is good movies. So that's probably all a very lame answer, but I don't have a proper answer to that.
Yep, that seems a fairly accurate answer. It is fiction. That's what compels us when we see growth or change.
It's a story, and then you become you like the characters, and you identify with them, and so.
And then a similar question from John asks, so many of your movies are about people struggling to be fully themselves but who inhabit social systems that suppress that effort. Can you talk about why that theme resonates with you?
That's the English pictures. Those are really the English. You could really only say that about the 4 English films. A Room with a View, especially, and Morris, and Howard's End, and The Remains of the Day. That's all about class. And so they're a sort of separate group, I think. You won't find that happening with the other films so much.
Well,
that isn't such a big thing. But Forster was, as a writer, was very, very, very conscious of the English class system, and had a lot of very critical things to say about it.
And then our next question is from Cheryl, who says, when you look back at your accomplishments, is there anything that you're most proud of?
Well, very often it's the films that weren't successful that I wanted to make, and it was a thrill to make them, but then nobody liked them. But the best example of that is Jefferson in Paris, which was just derided when it came out. And yet, to me, that was the bringing together of 2 interests of mine from childhood. One was that I'm partly Southern, and I know a lot about the South, and I've been there a lot, and I had an interest in the South and the stories from the South and about the South. And the other, I was always, from a small child on, and from when I first understood what a guillotine was, I've been interested in 18th century France. And I was able to bring those 2 things together in Jefferson in Paris. I mean, Jefferson was a Virginian, and that's not quite like the Deep South, but he was a Virginian. He was a Southerner and a slave owner and all that. And I was able to bring all that together and in one project. And so for that, that was, to me, a great thing to be able to do, but nobody liked it.
Thankfully, you did.
Well, yeah. Nobody could accept the idea that that Jefferson had a slave mistress. That was just such a fine man. Couldn't. I actually heard people say that. Such a fine man would not have done that, and had 5 children by her and all this sort of thing. They actually said that.
That's crazy.
I know it's crazy.
And then, unfortunately, we only have time for one last question. So this question is from Tony, who asks, have you read anything recently that you loved?
Well, I'm reading a very good book now. I'm reading The Magician. You know.
Yes. Well, yes, on that note, thank you so much, James and Peter, for such a fantastic, marvelous conversation. It's been an absolute pleasure to get to hear about an absolute genius and the work you've done. So thank you. It's a complete honor.
Thank you.
Thank
Fun
you, Jim.
to-
And to our audience, if you have not purchased a copy of Solid Ivory yet, there is a link in the chat. You've also been emailed a link, which you can just click on and go purchase your own copy of this fantastic memoir. And on that note, thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you. Thanks very much for listening.
Good night.